This video is for my mother. See, she was recently convinced to finally watch Deadpool. I wish I could take the credit for that, but it was actually cinema therapy that did it in the end. And I convinced her we needed to start off with the Blade trilogy, because without the Blade films, we would never have had the X-Men films, or Wolverine, or Deadpool, or even the Fantastic Four movies. And I wanted her to have a full appreciation of the story and everything that led all the way up to Deadpool and Wolverine. So we decided to watch it all in release order, starting with Blade, then X-Men, Blade 2, Daredevil, X2, X-Men United, Blade 3, which she was so grateful to be finished with. Blade just wasn't for her. Fantastic Four, X-Men The Last Stand, Fantastic Four The Rise of the Silver Surfer, X-Men Origins Wolverine, X-Men First Class The Wolverine, X-Men Days of Future Past, Deadpool, X-Men Apocalypse, Logan, Deadpool 2, X-Men Dark Phoenix, New Mutants, and finally Deadpool and Wolverine. That is a lot of movies. Oh, and I can't remember exactly when I remembered it, but I did throw in Green Lantern somewhere around the Wolverine or maybe Fantastic Four 2. Regardless, it was well before we got to Deadpool. Anyways, we've just finished off X-Men Apocalypse the other night, and what I've realized is that before we go any further, I really want to do a quick video explaining some of the history of what's left in the series, so I won't have to stop and explain anything anymore, and she'll just be able to sit back and enjoy it all. So I think a good place to start might be with the history of Wolverine in the comics and some of the most iconic moments in his career. Wolverine was introduced in 1974's Incredible Hulk number 181. Still the best Christmas present I've ever gotten, despite the stamp being cut out. Though he did have a cameo at the very end of the previous issue. He was created by Len Wein and John Romita Sr., and from that issue, absolutely nothing happened with him until he was brought into the X-Men in 1975's Giant Size X-Men number 1. One important detail of Wolverine is his height, or lack thereof. In the comics, he's officially 5 foot 3 inches tall, a far cry from Hugh Jackman's 6 foot 2, which fits his character perfectly. There have been numerous stories of Wolverines chasing full-grown grizzly bears away from their kills, even chasing them up trees. They're the honey badger of the Great White North. And in the comics, that's exactly what Wolverine is. A short, scrappy force of nature, able to get even unstoppable forces to back down. Initially, this was one of my biggest gripes about Hugh Jackman's casting, but I recall hearing that he addressed that somewhere, saying he understands the concern, and if it had been possible to surgically remove a few vertebrae to more accurately portray the character, he absolutely would have. I have no idea if he really said this, but it wouldn't surprise me. It was speculated a few years ago after Hugh Jackman announced he was retiring from the character. Yep, that didn't go as planned, did it? It was widely speculated that they'd get Henry Cavill to play Wolverine, but I would have the same problem with that. Still way too tall, but who knows? It could work. He's a great actor too. So, back to his history in the comics. It was during Wolverine's early time with the X-Men that it was revealed his claws were actually part of him, not just part of his costume. See, it was actually Len Wein's original intention to have the claws be part of his costume, with both the claws and the gloves being made of adamantium, but this changed when Chris Claremont took over writing the character and revealed they were part of him in 1976's X-Men number 98. Wolverine slowly became more and more popular of a character, eventually earning him his own 4-issue miniseries in 1982. This story would form the basis for the Wolverine. As you can see here, the final battle with Lord Shingen was just a little bit different from the one in the movie, and this opening kendo duel was completely omitted. I'm still a little bitter about that. After that, there was Kitty Pryde and Wolverine, a 6-issue miniseries from 1984 to 1985. That was my introduction to Lockheed, Kitty Pryde's companion. It wasn't his first appearance, but it was my introduction to the little rascal. Correction time. Lockheed did not show up in Kitty Pryde and Wolverine. I don't know where I first saw him. I can't remember. But he wasn't in these issues. My bad. And yes, he's named after Lockheed Martin, whose SR-71 Blackbird was the model for the X-Men's plane. I believe it's actually a modified Blackbird in canon as well, but I'd have to look into that further to be sure, and I'm just too lazy to do that right now. From there, Wolverine finally got his own ongoing series, the very first issue of which introduced Patch, an alter ego Wolverine adapts while the world believes the X-Men are dead. Long story, not important. Patch is basically Wolverine acting as a crime lord's conscience after helping her overthrow the old crime lord. He stuck with this persona for a while, getting into new trouble all the time. Yes, that's Hulk there in gray, Grey Hulk, also known as Mr. Fix-It, another long story, and a tale for another lore dive. During the early 90s, Wolverine was featured heavily in Marvel Comics Presents. Now, I've got a pretty decent collection of these issues, including the first 10, though only 4 of the issues that covered the Weapon X story arc. Here's where things get a bit sad. See, I always thought that these were just reprints of earlier stories. I had no idea at the time that these were entirely new tales being told. If I'd known that at the time, I'd have spent more time collecting the full Weapon X story, as it was such an incredible story and featured a truly iconic outfit, easily recognized from Hugh Jackman's portrayal of it in X-Men Apocalypse. Speaking of Apocalypse, this brings us to 1995, when all of the X-related titles were replaced for 4 issues with an alternate timeline and alternate titles during the Age of Apocalypse. It all begins when Legion, Xavier's psychic son, tries to go back in time to kill Magneto, but accidentally kills his dad instead. This somehow leads to Apocalypse striking 10 years before he does in the main timeline, and he actually wins. As I mentioned, the regular series were replaced with alternate titles for 4 issues, with Excalibur being replaced with Excalibur, or Excalibre. I don't know how they were supposed to pronounce it, but Excalibur became Excalibur. X-Force being replaced with Gambit and the Externals, Generation X with Generation Next, Uncanny X-Men with Astonishing X-Men, X-Men with Amazing X-Men, X-Factor with Factor X, Cable with X-Man, X-Men Unlimited with X-Universe, and Wolverine with Weapon X. Yes, there were that many different titles going at once. It was the golden age of the X-Men franchise. After 4 issues, this story arc was resolved, and the comics went back to their regular names. This is one of the only timelines in which Jean Grey actually chooses Wolverine over Cyclops. It didn't hurt that Cyclops actually sided with Apocalypse, but more importantly, it was the first time I had ever seen Wolverine permanently injured, with his left hand completely severed by Cyclops' optic blast, leading to one of my favorite versions of the character with his capped-off stump. Many other adventures occurred for Wolverine, but none of them really matter for this particular video, except for a few of the more iconic moments, namely the cover image for Uncanny X-Men number 251, where Logan is hung from a St. Andrew's cross by one of his many enemies. We'll not go into that story, as I barely remember it. I just remember that cover. There's also the iconic cover image from Uncanny X-Men number 141, the first part of the Days of Future Past story arc, which we've already watched. Believe it or not, that story arc was only 2 issues, this one and Uncanny X-Men number 142. Hard to believe that 2 little issues can have such a powerful impact when they aren't even technically part of the official timeline. And who can forget Incredible Hulk number 340, Hulk reflected in Wolverine's claws. Todd McFarlane did a great job with that cover. The issue itself is rather forgettable, just another excuse really for Hulk to fight Wolverine, but something about that cover really caught on and has been copied and imitated numerous times over the years. A far more compelling and powerful story, on the other hand, is Old Man Logan, a story arc from Wolverine Volume 3, numbers 66 through 72. In this alternate timeline story, the bad guys actually win and take over the world, splitting it into different territories controlled by the Abomination, later taken over by Hulk, Magneto, Doctor Doom, and Red Skull. All the superheroes are dead or in hiding. In this dystopian hellscape, Logan lives on a barren plot of worthless soil in Sacramento with his wife Maureen and their 2 kids, Scotty and Jade. Hulk controls this territory with a group known as the Hulk Gang, which are his grandkids from his incestuous union with his cousin She-Hulk. Yeah, this one got really weird and really dark. Anyways, one of the other surviving superheroes, Hawkeye, now blind, convinces Logan to join him for one last ride. Adventure ensues, heroes and villains die, and it all makes for a really amazing story, but the most important part of this tale is how it all started. How did the villains win, anyways? Turns out, back at the turning point of the timeline, Logan tries to defend the Xavier Institute from an attack, slaughtering all comers until the mansion is safe, only to discover that the attackers were his fellow X-Men. He'd been tricked by a particularly powerful illusion of Mysterio. Yeah, that's a fishbowl on his head, don't ask. This revelation of what he'd just done completely destroyed him mentally and emotionally, and after attempting and failing suicide, not an easy task for him to begin with, he basically swears off violence and becomes a pacifist. It's really one of the most shocking and powerful stories ever told about him, and a particular favorite of mine. And while this didn't end up being what they did with the next film, there's definitely elements of it in Logan, the next film we'll be watching. But enough about Logan. Let's talk about another character you'll need to know something about, and that's Cable, the guy Ferris Bueller Pool mentioned in the post-credits of Deadpool. Nathan Christopher Charles Summers, better known as Cable, is the son of Scott Summers, Cyclops, and his first wife, Madeline Pryor. A clone of Jean Grey, though they didn't know it at the time. Yeah, X-Men lore is wild. As an infant, Apocalypse infected Cable with a deadly techno-organic virus that would slowly turn his entire body into living metal. Not to get too bogged down into details, I'll just say it's not a particularly pleasant experience. In order to save him, he was sent into one possible future along with Cyclops and Jean Grey's minds, placed in alternate bodies in the future while their own bodies were still in the past on their honeymoon. Like I said, crazy lore. There is a lot more to this story than I'm mentioning here, but it just gets so in-depth that it's just not worth getting into here, not for our purposes. The important part is that Cable was raised in a future timeline where he was taught to use his telekinetic powers to stop or slow the spread of the virus in his arm, before coming back to the present day and becoming a powerful ally of the X-Men. Also an ally to Deadpool despite having absolutely zero patience for Wade and his shenanigans. They had an entire ongoing series for years, and it's some of the funniest comics out there. Now, just a side note, when I say he's one of the most powerful allies, that's not hyperbole. He uses a large portion of his power to constantly 24/7 keep the virus in check, and he's still one of the biggest badasses in comics. His alternate timeline version, X-Man, never got infected and is an Omega-level mutant, a category of mutants whose power levels are functionally beyond the ability to measure or quantify. They're essentially demigods, to put it in other terms. So yeah, Cable's pretty much unstoppable if he ever gets cured and can stop splitting his focus. Anyways, a side note about Deadpool himself. Created by Fabian Nicieza and Rob Liefeld, I'm pretty sure I'm screwing up that first name. He first appeared in New Mutants number 98 in December of 1990. Liefeld's always been a fan of the Teen Titans series, and upon first seeing the original concept art for Deadpool, Nicieza said it's just Deathstroke from Teen Titans. This led to the decision to name Deadpool Wade Wilson, an inside joke reference to Deathstroke's real name, Slade Wilson. Well, hopefully that covers about everything you'll need to fully enjoy and appreciate the remainder of the films in the X-Men Deadpool franchise. Now, let's go watch Logan. Love you, Ma.